"You can't stay here anymore, Margaret. This isn't your home," my daughter-in-law said, her voice calm enough to make it worse, like she had rehearsed it. I remember the way the kitchen light flickered above us, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence my son left behind as he stared at his plate, pretending not to hear a word. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just nodded, folded my coat over my arm, and walked out of the house I had lived in for over 30 years. That night, I slept in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour grocery store on Maple Avenue, the kind with bright fluorescent lights that never turn off. The temperature dropped to 42 degrees, and I pulled my coat tighter around me, watching people come and go with carts full of things they needed, while I tried to understand how I had gone from being the center of a family to someone with nowhere to go. I kept thinking there had to be a mistake, that Daniel would call, that he would come out and say he didn't mean it, that this was all just some misunderstanding that could be fixed with a conversation over coffee in the morning. But my phone stayed silent on the passenger seat, its dark screen reflecting back a woman I barely recognized, her silver hair tucked behind her ears, her eyes wide and hollow in the glow of the dashboard. I closed my eyes for a moment, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I drifted, I saw Ashley standing there again, arms crossed, telling me I was too much to handle, like I was a bill that had finally come due. I had spent years making sure that house ran smoothly, making sure Daniel never had to worry about a thing, cooking dinners, paying bills when he couldn't, even helping them with the down payment when they said they were struggling. And now suddenly there was no space left for me. Around 2 in the morning, a security truck drove slowly past my car, its headlights sweeping across the windshield, and for a moment I thought they might ask me to leave even there. I sat up straighter, trying to look like I belonged, like I was just waiting for someone, like I wasn't a 72-year-old woman with everything she owned packed into 2 small suitcases in the back seat. When the truck moved on, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I reached for my purse and counted what I had left. $37 and some loose change. Not enough for a hotel, not enough for more than a few nights of cheap meals. I looked out at the glowing store sign again and made a quiet decision I never thought I would have to make. In the morning, I would find somewhere to sleep, even if it meant giving up something I couldn't get back. Because sitting there in that cold car, watching the world move on without me, I understood one thing clearly for the first time in my life. No one was coming to fix this for me. I woke up just before sunrise with a stiffness in my neck that reminded me I had not slept in a real bed, just curled against the driver's side door with my coat pulled tight around me, and for a moment I did not remember where I was until I saw the grocery store sign still glowing through the windshield and heard the early delivery trucks backing into the loading dock with their steady beeping sound. The sky was pale gray, and the parking lot was nearly empty now, the night crowd gone, replaced by a few early shoppers who walked past my car without looking inside, as if I were just another part of the background. I sat there for a while, letting the engine warm up, feeling the faint heat finally reach my hands, and I realized how quiet everything felt without the familiar sounds of my kitchen, the ticking clock, the low murmur of morning news that Daniel used to turn on before work. I had always believed that a home was something solid, something you could rely on, but sitting there in that cold car, I understood how quickly it could disappear when it no longer belonged to you in someone else's eyes. I reached for my purse again, counting the money one more time as if the number might change overnight, but it was still the same $37, folded neatly and waiting for a decision I was not ready to make. I drove out of the parking lot slowly, unsure where I was going, just following the familiar streets of a town that suddenly felt unfamiliar to me, passing by the coffee shop where I used to meet friends, the small park where I had taken Daniel when he was a boy, the bank on the corner that I had not stepped into in years because his father had always handled those things. The thought lingered in my mind longer than it should have, but I pushed it aside, focusing instead on the immediate problem of finding a place to rest for a few hours. By mid-morning, I found myself parked outside a small clinic on Jefferson Street, the kind of place with a faded sign and a line of people waiting quietly by the door, and I noticed a flyer taped to the window that read in bold letters that compensation was offered for participation in a medical study. No insurance required. I stared at those words longer than I expected to, my fingers resting on the steering wheel as I tried to decide if this was something I could do, something I should do, because I had never imagined that I would be the kind of person who considered selling a part of myself just to afford a night indoors. But the truth was simple, and it sat heavily in my chest as I looked at the line growing longer, at the people who had already made that decision without hesitation. I stepped out of the car and joined them, keeping my eyes forward, listening to the quiet conversations around me about rent, about bills, about things that sounded painfully familiar now. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee, and a woman behind the desk handed me a clipboard with forms that asked questions about my health, my history, things I had not thought about in years, and I answered each one carefully, my handwriting steady even though my hand still felt cold. When she told me how much they would pay, it was not a fortune, not even close, but it was enough for a cheap motel room for a few nights, enough to give me time to think, to plan, to breathe without watching the temperature drop outside my window. I nodded, agreeing before I could change my mind, and as I sat in the waiting area, I folded my coat over my lap and looked around at the other people there, wondering how many of them had once had homes they believed would never be taken away from them. I did not feel ashamed the way I thought I would. I felt something else, something quieter, more controlled, like a shift I could not quite name yet. Because as I signed the last page and handed it back, I realized that for the first time since I had walked out of that house, I was not waiting for someone else to decide what happened to me next. The motel room cost $49 a night plus tax, and when the clerk slid the key card across the counter, I held it a second longer than necessary, as if it might disappear if I let go too quickly, as if this small square of plastic was the only thing keeping me from going back to that parking lot. The room itself was on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older that never quite went away, and when I opened the door, I stood there for a moment, taking it in slowly, the thin carpet, the narrow bed with a patterned blanket, the small table by the window that overlooked the highway. It was not much, but it was quiet and it was warm, and for the first time in 2 nights I could close a door behind me and no one would tell me to leave. I set my suitcases down carefully, placing them side by side against the wall, and sat on the edge of the bed, pressing my palm against the mattress as if testing whether it was real. My body felt heavier than usual, the kind of tired that settles deep in your bones, but my mind would not slow down. I kept replaying the clinic in my head, the forms I had signed, the way the nurse had spoken to me in a practiced, reassuring tone, explaining that everything was safe, that many people participated, that I was helping research while also helping myself. I had nodded along, listening without really hearing, focused instead on the number she had mentioned, the amount they would transfer after completion, enough to cover a few nights here, maybe a week if I was careful. It was not a solution, but it was something. I lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling, where a faint crack ran from one corner to the other, and I tried to let my thoughts settle into something manageable, something I could understand, but they kept circling back to the same question that had followed me since I walked out of that house. Why had this happened so suddenly, and why did it feel like I had been the only one caught off guard? Daniel had not looked surprised. That was what stayed with me the most. He had not argued, had not asked Ashley to reconsider, had not even walked me to the door. He had just sat there, quiet, as if this had already been decided long before that night. I turned my head toward the window, watching the steady stream of cars on the highway, their headlights passing in a constant rhythm, and I realized that there must have been signs, small things I had ignored or explained away because it was easier to believe everything was fine. The way Ashley had started handling the mail more often, the way she would step into the room when I was speaking with Daniel and redirect the conversation, the way certain topics seemed to close as soon as I entered. At the time I had told myself it was normal, that young couples needed their space, that I should not interfere. But now, lying there in a motel room I had paid for by giving away something I barely understood, those moments felt different, like pieces of a puzzle I had not known I was supposed to be solving. I sat up slowly, reaching for my purse again, pulling out the copy of the paperwork the clinic had given me. The pages were neatly stapled, filled with terms I did not fully understand, references to samples, to studies, to potential long-term value that had seemed like standard language when I first read them. But now, with nothing else to distract me, I found myself reading each line more carefully, my eyes moving slower, stopping at phrases that did not quite sit right. There was a section about storage, about proprietary research, about rights that extended beyond the initial compensation, and I felt a faint unease settle in my chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, just enough to make me pause. I had signed without asking questions because I needed a place to sleep, because I did not think there was anything more to it than a simple exchange. But the longer I looked at those pages, the more I wondered if I had overlooked something important, something that other people might have noticed immediately. I folded the papers back together and set them on the table beside the bed, my fingers lingering on the edge of the stack, and I realized that the feeling I had earlier at the clinic, that quiet sense of control, was still there, but it had changed slightly, sharpened at the edges. I was no longer just reacting to what had happened to me. I was starting to look at it, to question it, to see where it might lead if I followed it far enough. And for the first time since I had left that house, I understood that what had been taken from me might not be the only thing that mattered anymore. The next morning I woke up before the alarm I had set on my phone, the kind of light sleep that never really feels like rest, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was until I saw the thin curtain shift slightly with the air from the vent and heard the distant hum of cars on the highway below. I sat up slowly, my back stiff, my hands resting on my knees as I tried to collect my thoughts, but my eyes kept drifting to the stack of papers I had placed on the table the night before. They looked ordinary in the morning light, just another set of forms among many, but something about them felt heavier now, like they carried more than what was written on the page. I stood up and walked over, picking them up again, smoothing the edges with my fingers as I read through them once more, slower this time, not just scanning but paying attention to every line, every word that I had rushed past before. There was a section I had barely noticed yesterday, something about extended research use in long-term storage, and I found myself reading it twice, then a third time, trying to understand what it meant in plain terms, not the careful language it was written in. It did not say anything alarming outright, but it also did not feel simple. It felt like something designed to be overlooked by people who did not have the time or the energy to question it. I set the papers down and reached for my phone, opening the browser with a hesitation I could not explain, typing in a few of the terms I had seen, words that sounded technical but important, and as the results appeared, I felt a quiet shift in my chest. The first few pages were general explanations, articles about medical studies, about how certain samples could be used for research, but as I read further, I started to notice something else: mentions of rare cases, of unique biological markers, of situations where something ordinary turned out to be valuable in ways no one expected at first. I was not a scientist and I did not pretend to understand everything I was reading, but I understood enough to realize that there was more to this than the small amount they had offered me at the desk. I sat down at the edge of the bed again, my phone still in my hand, and thought about the way the nurse had avoided going into too much detail, the way she had kept her explanation simple, almost too simple, as if the complexity did not matter because most people would not ask about it anyway. I thought about Ashley, about the way she had always been interested in details that other people ignored, the way she handled paperwork, finances, anything that involved information that could be turned into an advantage if you knew how to use it. A memory surfaced then, small but clear, from a few months ago, when a letter had arrived addressed to me, something from a medical office I did not recognize, and Ashley had picked it up from the table before I had a chance to open it, telling me it was probably just a routine notice and that she would take care of it. At the time I had not questioned it. I had trusted her the way I trusted my own family, assuming there was nothing in that envelope that required my attention. Now, sitting in that quiet motel room with the morning light creeping further across the floor, that moment felt different. It felt like a piece of something larger, something I had not been allowed to see. I stood up again, pacing slowly across the room, the carpet soft under my feet, and I tried to connect the pieces in a way that made sense. The clinic, the paperwork, the language about long-term value, the memory of that unopened letter, the way Ashley had been so certain that I needed to leave, that there was no place for me anymore. It did not feel random anymore. It felt deliberate, even if I could not yet see the full shape of it. I stopped by the window, looking out at the highway again, the steady flow of cars moving in one direction or another, each of them carrying someone who knew where they were going, and I realized that I did not need to understand everything all at once. I just needed to take the next step, the one that would bring me closer to the truth instead of further away from it. I picked up my purse, slipped the papers back inside, and checked the time. The clinic would be open again in an hour. And this time I was not going back as someone who needed a place to sleep. I was going back as someone who had questions that were not going to be ignored. I arrived at the clinic 15 minutes before it opened, earlier than anyone else, and I sat in my car watching the front door as if it might reveal something before I even stepped inside, the same faded sign hanging above it, the same flyer still taped to the window promising compensation in bold, simple words that no longer felt simple to me. When the door finally unlocked, I did not wait for the small line to form behind me like it had the day before. I walked straight in, the bell above the door chiming softly, And the same woman behind the desk looked up with a polite smile that paused for just a fraction of a second when she recognized me. "Back again?" she asked, her tone light, almost routine, but I noticed the way her fingers stopped moving over the keyboard. I nodded and placed my purse on the counter, pulling out the copy of the paperwork and setting it down between us, not sliding it forward, just letting it rest there where she could see it. "I have a few questions," I said, keeping my voice even, not confrontational, just steady enough that she could not dismiss it as uncertainty. She glanced down at the papers and then back at me, her smile returning, but it was different now, more careful. "Of course," she said, gesturing toward a chair. "We can go over anything you need." I did not sit. Instead, I opened the folder and turned it toward her, tapping lightly on the section I had read 3 times the night before. "This part," I said, "about long-term use in storage. What exactly does that mean in plain language?" For a moment, she did not answer right away. And that moment told me more than her words ever could. Then she leaned forward slightly, folding her hands together as if preparing a practiced explanation. "It means that your sample may be used in ongoing research projects," she said, choosing each word carefully. "That is standard in studies like this. It allows us to continue learning from the data over time." I nodded slowly as if I accepted that, but I did not look away. "And if what you learn becomes valuable," I continued, "does that change anything for the person it came from?" Her eyes flickered just briefly, and I saw it then, the smallest crack in the calm surface she was trying to maintain. "The compensation you received is for your participation," she replied, her voice still measured. "That does not change based on future outcomes." I let the silence sit between us for a second longer than was comfortable. Then I asked the question that had been forming since the moment I read those pages in the motel room. "Has anyone contacted you about my file before I came in yesterday?" This time she did not answer immediately. Her gaze shifted, not away, but slightly to the side, as if she were choosing how much to say and how to say it. "We receive many inquiries," she said finally. "Some are general, some are specific. I would not be able to discuss that without reviewing records." It was not a denial. That was what mattered. I closed the folder slowly and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it in a way I had not before. "I would like to review those records," I said. My voice did not rise. I did not need to. Something in it had changed, something that came from understanding that I was no longer just a participant in something I did not control. She studied me for a moment, and whatever she saw seemed to shift her response. "I will need to speak with our administrator," she said, standing up. "Please have a seat." This time I sat, placing the folder neatly on my lap, my hands resting on either side of it, and I watched as she disappeared through a door at the back of the office. The waiting room was quiet, the same faint smell of disinfectant lingering in the air, the same row of chairs filled with people who were there for reasons I now understood more clearly. But I was not here for the same reason anymore. A few minutes passed, though it felt longer, and when the door opened again, a man stepped out with her, older, dressed in a pressed shirt and tie that did not quite match the rest of the clinic's simplicity. He looked at me directly, not with surprise, but with a kind of measured interest that told me he already knew who I was. "Mrs. Collins," he said, offering a polite nod. "I understand you have some questions." I stood up slowly, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and for the first time since I had walked out of my own home, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not fear, but clarity. Because whatever this was, whatever had been set in motion before I even realized it, I was no longer standing outside of it. I was standing right at the center. The man led me into a small office at the back of the clinic, closing the door behind us with a quiet click that seemed louder than it should have been, and he gestured toward a chair across from his desk, his movements calm but deliberate, as if he had done this many times before. I sat down without hesitation, placing the folder on the desk in front of me, keeping my hands resting lightly on top of it so there was no confusion about why I was there. He took his seat slowly, folding his hands together, studying me for a moment in silence before he spoke. "You are asking questions that most participants do not ask," he said, not as a warning but as a simple observation. I held his gaze. "That is because most participants are not trying to understand what they signed after sleeping in their car," I replied, my voice steady, not sharp, just clear enough that he could hear exactly what I meant. Something shifted in his expression then, not surprise but acknowledgement, as if he had just decided to adjust how honest he was going to be with me. He reached for a file on his desk, opened it, and turned it slightly so he could read from it, though his eyes kept returning to me as he spoke. "Your sample," he began, choosing his words carefully, "shows markers that are considered uncommon. That is part of the reason your application was processed quickly." I did not interrupt. I let him continue. "There was prior interest in identifying candidates with similar profiles," he added. And that was the moment the pieces I had been holding separately began to connect in a way that felt undeniable. "Prior interest," I repeated quietly. "From whom?" He paused, not long but long enough to confirm that the answer was not simple. "From a private research partner," he said. "They collaborate with us on certain studies. They review data patterns, not individual names, unless a participant consents." I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that settle, then asked the question that mattered most. "And did anyone try to connect my name to that data before I walked in here yesterday?" This time he did not avoid the answer. "There was an inquiry," he said. "A request for confirmation regarding a potential match. It was not completed." I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not anger, something sharper, more focused. "Who made that request?" I asked. He closed the file gently, resting his hand on top of it. "I cannot disclose that without proper authorization," he said, but his tone had changed again, less guarded now, more careful in a different way, as if he understood that I was not going to walk away without understanding what I needed to understand. I nodded once, accepting that answer for the moment, because I already knew enough to see the outline of what had been happening. The unopened letter. Ashley taking it before I could read it. The quiet shift in how decisions were made in that house. The certainty in her voice when she told me to leave, as if she already knew something I did not. Placed my hand flat on the folder and spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "If my sample is as uncommon as you say, and if there has already been interest in it, then the compensation I received does not reflect its actual value." It was not a question. He did not treat it like one. "The compensation reflects the agreement you signed," he replied, just as steady. "Value in this context is not always immediate or guaranteed." I held his gaze, not challenging, not arguing, just making it clear that I understood the distinction he was trying to draw. "But it exists," I said. He did not answer right away, and in that silence I found my answer. I stood up slowly, gathering the folder, my movements calm, controlled, and for the first time since this had begun, I did not feel like I was trying to catch up to something that had already happened. I felt like I was finally standing on the same ground as the people who had been making decisions without me. "If I want to revisit this agreement," I said, adjusting my coat over my arm, "who do I need to speak with?" He met my eyes again, and this time there was no hesitation. "A legal advisor," he said. "And you should do that sooner rather than later." I nodded once, turning toward the door, my hand resting briefly on the handle before I opened it. The waiting room looked the same as before, the same chairs, the same quiet conversations, but it no longer felt like a place I had come to out of necessity. It felt like a place where something had been revealed, something that had been hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. As I walked out into the morning light, I realized that being forced out of my home had not left me with nothing. It had forced me to see something that I might never have questioned otherwise. And now that I could see it, I was not going to ignore it. I did not go back to the motel right away. Instead, I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, the folder resting on the passenger seat, and I stared straight ahead at nothing in particular while everything I had just learned settled into place in my mind. The noise of the street around me faded into something distant, like it belonged to a different part of the day, a different version of myself who had not yet understood what was happening beneath the surface. I replayed every word the man had said, every pause, every careful answer that told me more than the words themselves. There had been interest before I ever walked into that clinic. Someone had already been looking for something like me. And somehow, without ever saying it out loud, I knew exactly who had been paying attention. Ashley had always been attentive in a way that did not seem obvious at first. She listened more than she spoke, noticed small details, handled things quietly so that others did not have to think about them. I had once admired that about her. I had thought it meant she was responsible, that she cared about keeping things in order. Now I saw it differently. Now I saw how easily that kind of attention could be used to control what other people saw and what they did not. I remembered the way she had taken that letter from my hands months ago, the way she had smiled and told me it was nothing important, the way Daniel had not questioned it because he trusted her judgment more than his own. At the time I had told myself it was a small thing. Now it felt like the beginning of something I had never been meant to understand. I reached over and picked up the folder, opening it again even though I already knew what was inside, letting my eyes move across the lines not to read them, but to remind myself that this was real, that this was something that could be proven, something that existed beyond suspicion or memory. Then I closed it again and placed it carefully back in my purse. I did not feel overwhelmed. That was the surprising part. I felt clear. For the first time since I had been told to leave, I was not reacting to what had already happened. I was deciding what would happen next. I started the car and drove slowly, not toward the motel, but toward a part of town I had not visited in years, where the buildings were older and the signs were simpler, where offices did not try to impress you with polished glass and bright lights, but instead relied on the quiet confidence of people who had been doing the same work for a long time. I parked in front of a small brick building with a narrow sign that read Collins and Harper Legal Services, and I sat there for a moment before stepping out, adjusting my coat, making sure my hands were steady. Inside, the air was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from a place where people listen more than they speak, and a woman at the front desk looked up with a polite nod as I approached. "How can we help you today?" she asked, her tone professional but not distant. I placed my purse on the counter and rested my hand on it lightly. "I need to understand an agreement I signed," I said, choosing my words carefully, "and I need to know what my options are if that agreement does not reflect the full value of what was taken." She studied me for a moment, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that suggested she was deciding who to connect me with. Then she nodded once and gestured toward a chair. "Please have a seat. Someone will be with you shortly." I sat down, folding my hands in my lap, and as I waited, I thought about the house I had left behind, about the kitchen table, the quiet mornings, the life I had believed would continue the same way for years to come. That life was gone. But something else had taken its place, something I had not chosen, but something I now understood well enough to face. When the door to the inner office opened and a man stepped out, older, composed, with a kind of presence that did not need to announce itself, I stood up to meet him without hesitation. And in that moment I realized that whatever Ashley had planned, whatever she had expected would happen after I walked out that door, she had not planned for this. She had not planned for me to ask the right questions. The man introduced himself as Mr. Harper, and when he gestured for me to follow him into his office, I noticed the way he moved with quiet confidence, not rushed, not distracted, as if he had already decided to give me his full attention. Before I even spoke, the office was simple: a wooden desk, 2 chairs, shelves lined with files that looked used rather than decorative, and when I sat down across from him, I placed the folder on the desk without hesitation, opening it to the pages that had kept me awake the night before. He did not interrupt while I explained, and I appreciated that more than anything he could have said. I told him about the clinic, the agreement, the language that felt too broad to be accidental, and the conversation I had just had with the administrator, making sure to repeat his exact words as closely as I could remember them. Mr. Harper listened with his hands folded, his eyes steady, occasionally nodding slightly, not to agree, but to acknowledge that he was following every detail. When I finished, the room felt quieter than before, and he leaned forward just enough to look more closely at the documents. He read them slowly, turning each page with care, and I watched his expression not for reaction but for change. It came gradually, a subtle tightening around his eyes, a slight pause at certain lines, the kind of response that did not need to be explained out loud. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm, but there was something firm beneath it. "This agreement gives them more control than it appears at first glance," he said. "It is written in a way that assumes the participant will not challenge it." I felt a quiet confirmation settle in my chest. Not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity. "Can it be challenged?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a notepad and wrote something down, then looked back at me. "That depends on timing, documentation, and whether there is evidence that information was withheld or misrepresented before you signed, he said. But more importantly, it depends on whether someone had prior knowledge of your eligibility and acted on it before you were informed. I held his gaze, not needing to say the name that was already forming in my mind. He understood anyway. If someone intercepted communication intended for you, he continued, or influenced your decision without full disclosure, that changes the situation significantly. I nodded slowly, thinking back to the letter I never opened, the way Ashley had handled it without hesitation, the way Daniel had trusted her without question. What would you need from me? I asked. Mr. Harper set his pen down and folded his hands again. Everything you remember, he said. Dates, conversations, anything that felt unusual at the time, even if it seemed small. And we will need to request records from the clinic, including any inquiries made about your file before your visit. I let that settle, feeling the weight of what that meant, not as something overwhelming, but as something structured, something that could be approached step by step. And if those records show what I think they will? I asked. He did not hesitate this time. Then you are no longer just a participant, he said. You are someone whose rights may have been compromised. The words were precise, measured, but they carried more than their surface meaning. I sat back slightly, letting my hands rest in my lap, and for a moment I thought about the version of myself from just a few days ago, the one who had trusted without question, who had believed that family decisions were made with care, not calculation. That version of me would not have been sitting here. But I was no longer that person. I reached into my purse and took out the folder again, sliding it fully across the desk this time, not holding onto it. Then let us find out, I said. Mr. Harper nodded once, not as encouragement but as agreement, and as he began to outline the next steps, the process of requesting records, reviewing timelines, and preparing for what might come next, I listened carefully, not just to the words but to the structure behind them. This was not about reacting anymore. It was about building something solid from the pieces I had been given, something that could not be dismissed or ignored. When I finally stood to leave, the air outside felt different, not lighter, not easier, but clearer, as if the path in front of me, while still uncertain, was no longer hidden. And as I walked back to my car, I realized that whatever Ashley had set in motion, whatever she believed she had secured by pushing me out, she had made one mistake she could not undo. She had assumed I would not look closely enough to understand what had been taken from me, and she had been wrong. 3 days later I was sitting in the same office across from Mr. Harper when he placed a thin stack of printed documents in front of me, each page neatly aligned, each one carrying more weight than it appeared to at first glance, and he did not speak immediately, which told me that whatever was in those pages did not need introduction to be understood. I rested my hands on the table, not reaching for them right away, giving myself a moment to steady my breath, because something in the air had shifted, something that felt final in a way I could not yet explain. We received the records from the clinic this morning, he said at last, his voice even measured, the same tone he had used before, but this time there was a quiet certainty behind it that had not been there before. I nodded once and pulled the stack closer, my eyes moving across the first page, then the second, then the third, each line confirming what had only been suspicion before, each detail connecting in a way that left no space for doubt. There had been an inquiry made under my name nearly 2 weeks before I ever walked into that clinic, not a general inquiry, but a specific request tied directly to my profile, my medical history, my eligibility, and the name attached to that request was not one I recognized immediately, but the contact information that followed it was unmistakable. It led back to an account registered under Ashley's name, linked through a consulting service that specialized in medical data coordination, something I had never known she was involved in. Something she had never mentioned in all the years we had lived under the same roof. I felt no rush of emotion as I read it, no anger, no shock, just a steady clarity that settled deeper with each page, like a picture coming into focus after being blurred for too long. She had known. Not guessed, not suspected. Known. And she had acted on that knowledge before I ever had the chance to understand it myself. I set the papers down carefully, aligning them with the edge of the desk, my fingers resting lightly on top of them as I looked up at Mr. Harper. She tried to access it before I even knew it existed, I said, not as a question but as a simple statement. A fact. He nodded once. And when that request did not go through, she no longer had a reason to keep you close. he added, his words calm, but precise enough to land exactly where they needed to. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting that settle into place, thinking about the timing, the sudden shift in her behavior, the certainty in her voice when she told me to leave, the absence of hesitation from Daniel, who had likely been given a version of the story that made sense to him, one that did not require him to question anything at all. What happens next? I asked. Mr. Harper reached for the top page and turned it slightly toward me, pointing to a section I had not yet read closely. We file a formal challenge to the agreement, he said. We request full disclosure from the clinic and the research partner, and we present evidence that you were denied critical information before consenting. He paused briefly, then added, and we include documentation of the prior inquiry, which establishes intent. I nodded slowly, not because I needed to be convinced, but because I understood exactly what that meant. This was no longer about a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was about a sequence of decisions that had been made deliberately, with the expectation that I would never question them. I gathered the papers into a single stack again and held them in my hands, feeling their weight in a way that was no longer abstract. Then we proceed, I said. My voice did not waver. It did not need to. Mr. Harper gave a small, approving nod and began outlining the next steps, the filings, the timelines, the communications that would follow, and I listened carefully, not missing a single detail, because this was no longer something happening around me. This was something I was actively shaping. When I left the office that afternoon, the sun was lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and as I walked back to my car, I felt a quiet steadiness settle into my chest, not relief, not satisfaction, but something stronger than both. Because for the first time since I had been told to leave, I was no longer trying to understand what had been taken from me. I was preparing to take it back, not through anger or confrontation, but through something far more precise, something that could not be dismissed or ignored. And somewhere in a house that was no longer mine, Ashley was likely still certain that everything had gone exactly as she planned. She did not know that the story had already begun to change.